Give me a thumbs up when you're ready. Okay, we're ready. Good morning. Um, I don't know. We're televising this program or this class today. I don't know how much longer we're going to be able to do that. We have a little problem with our engineer. He claims he has a job, and long about March he has to go to work a little more dedicatedly. But we did already had one request to make sure we're going to be on the air today. Vanessa was saying that one of her children is ill, and she couldn't be here, so she wanted to be able to see it, and hopefully she's able to hook on to YouTube and be with us this morning. I guess that means there won't be any more snow days. I'll have to be here, and all of you will be home watching, but except Mom. I'm not hooking her up with Wi-Fi in the house. But anyway, I have come across a bunch of good maps that I don't know. I couldn't get on the computer I was using, so I wanted to do just a little bit. I know 2 or 3 of you do not like map work, who shall remain nameless. But okay, Bob, I'm going to move it over. But I did want to kind of refresh our memories or whatever about the area that we're dealing with. And just to kind of refresh where you are or where we are, Jesus, of course, he preached in the synagogue here at Nazareth, was rejected down in this area. The widow of Nain's son, just to sort of show you, here was the marriage feast in Cana, working around through here. Capernaum, way up here on a plain. There's a plain right here. I think one of the later maps will show you that just a little bit better. Capernaum here, and then Bethsaida over here. You remember the denunciation, woe unto thee, Chorazin, and Bethsaida, Capernaum. And then Gergasa, which we were studying about last week, roughly right about here. There's a kind of a headland that comes out to the sea. There's also, by the way, a plain right in this area that, but there is a headland here for those, the pigs that we were talking about to have jumped off the cliff into the sea. But you can see Gadara, which is, you remember us referring to the Gadarene demoniac. Gadara is way down here. That's about 50 miles, I think, down through there. But it was the principal city in this area. So that's one of the big reasons, I believe, why in 1 or 2 of the gospel accounts you'll have reference to the Gadarene demoniac, and others you'll have reference to the Gergesene demoniac, that it was there in Gergasa, whereas another one's citing the major city in that area. Let me see if I can, I wanted to pick up a couple of others. I'll see if I can get them down to a size where we can all see them. This is kind of interesting. I think I have one later that will show it a little bit better. The major city in this area is right here at Tiberias, which was building. Really, it was a Gentile city, and that's why it's not really even mentioned in the New Testament. But it was building at the time Jesus was growing up, and probably Jesus and his father. It's close enough for them to have walked over there, or worked over there, done a lot of their carpentry work over in this city that was building during this time. But anyway, you can see again some of these. What I wanted you to show you, you remember, as I say, I think there's another map here in just a minute that'll show it better. I might even blow that up bigger so you can see it. Here we go. This gives a little bit more of the topography. You remember when the storm of wind came up and the disciples were worried that I commented to you that Luke says that the wind came down on them. Well, if you look at it, The Sea of Galilee, as you notice, is surrounded by hills that are 2,000 or 3,000 feet up, with some plains. Here's this plain that I mentioned around Capernaum, another plain sort of along the coast there around Bethsaida, and this shows roughly that point of land that comes out where Gergasa would have been. But you can see why the wind would have come down on them. That any kind of wind blowing would have had a. That's why the scripture refers to it as coming down. And let's see. Was it? Yeah, this was the last one I wanted to use this morning, if you don't mind. Here a little bit. We bang out some from it. This, again, shows something of that topography a little bit better. This is showing Magdala, which was the home of Mary Magdalene. A lot of people, so many people have associated Mary Magdalene with as being a harlot or a prostitute that used to be. I don't think they are so much anymore, but there used to be all sorts of homes to try to refurbish harlots, and they were usually called a Magdalene home. Well, she wasn't called Magdalene because of her profession, which there's no way to prove that was her profession. Bible doesn't ever intimate it. It was her home. She was from Magdala, which is right here on this this sea coast, and of course up here again, this plain of around Capernaum, and over here this plain around Bethesda, Chorazin back here where Jesus would have done some preaching. Roughly right here, this map is saying is the traditional site of the Sermon on the Mount, which I suppose makes as much sense as any. That's on high ground, and it's in this rough area where he would have been teaching, somewhere around here, maybe calling Jesus or Levi and Simeon and Andrew and James and John and so forth, the others. The feeding of the multitudes was over here on this plain of Bethesda, on this side of the lake, and and roughly offshore here somewhere, Jesus would have appeared to his disciples on the sea. And again, here's Gergasa that we mentioned down here. So we can go from there, and one of these did. Let me back up just a little bit to one of the previous ones. I think this will. Yeah. Here it is. Nazareth is right here, down here. Just a short distance, maybe 10, 12 miles across there to the coast over here. All righty. And I don't want to fight to find them right now. We might do a little bit more map work. Since I've got that, I want to do a little, there was a much better map in our Wednesday night study than the one I had the other day. I was irritated I couldn't find it, and so we'll work on that some tomorrow night. But anyway, we are in the 8th chapter of Luke, and we're in about verse 40, 41, roughly in that area, toward the latter part of the chapter. And it'd be nice if we could video this, but I just don't have enough staff, and I'm about to work our engineer to death up there doing all these programs. And so we may not be able to do this forever. This is, as I mentioned, these 4 miracles are all in all 3 Gospels are cited together. Jesus has come back from the healing of the Gadarene demoniac and from the storm in the sea. And in verse 40, it came to pass that when Jesus was returned, the people gladly received him, for they were all waiting for them. So there was sort of a welcome home. We're glad to see you when he finally gets there. And behold, there came a man named Jairus. He was a ruler of the synagogue, and he fell down at Jesus' feet and besought him that he would come into his house. Now, this is somewhat incredible. This man would have been of the highest sort of social rank in this area. He it's kind of hard. The people of this rank more than likely were a little suspicious of Jesus, were beginning to be inimical. The Pharisees were. And so perhaps it was only desperation that drove him to this urgency. But he fell down at his feet and besought him that he, in fact, Mark says he besought him greatly. My little daughter dieth at the point of death. And this, of course, these two miracles that we're going to talk about today are, Dave, are you able to pick me up? This wide desk, you're able to pick me up okay on the thing? Okay, these two miracles are divided, and we'll go ahead and study them as divided, but we're going to introduce the text as we go. The people around must have been desperately curious to see what was going on, because in verse 42, it says, as he went, the people thronged him. And this is a sort of a unique sort of expression, unique sort of word that's used in this on this occasion. They thronged him. There's two or three interesting things about this. One is, Luke goes out of his way to introduce to us only children. You remember the widow of Nain's son? Luke specifies that was an only child. In that case, we're going to see in the 9th chapter that the epileptic boy that Jesus heals, the Bible's Luke's very specific, telling us that was an only child that he healed. When he comes, she was dying. She lay dying is the terminology that's used in this instance. But as he went, the people thronged him. I wanted to pick up a word there. Yes, it is to press together. It's used in Luke 8:14 as a jam, it's used in, I think 8:14 is the account, Luke's brief account of the parable of the sower, where the thorns are choking out the seed in the parable of the sower. It's the same word used here. They're thronging. They're so thronging about him that it's just throttling, choking him. And that's important, of course, for the next point. Next point that is made in this particular instance. Let me see. I like this new desk. I can spread out a little bit and find my notes quicker. Yeah. I mentioned the only child thing. Luke almost seems to be putting those in purposefully and stressing those points, I think, to point out something of the compassion of Jesus, that these were only children, and therefore he's wanting to talk about that. Okay, verse 43, and a woman having an issue of blood 12 years, which had spent all her living upon physicians, neither could be healed of any, came behind him and touched the border of his garment. And immediately her issue of blood stanched. There's a number of things about this that are interesting. One is interesting is the way Luke reports this. Luke, the physician, is a little careful about his reporting. Luke says she had spent all her living upon physicians, whereas Mark says that she had suffered many things of many physicians, had spent all she'd had, and then he adds, was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse. Well, Luke doesn't tell us that stuff. Luke simply says she couldn't be healed. And it's almost as if maybe Luke's sort of protecting the reputation of physicians, being one himself. He doesn't like that reporting about this sort of thing. But anyway, roughly the same idea, but it is kind of interesting that Mark's a little bit more pointed about this than Luke is. Luke draws back just a bit. Of course, both of them, or all three of them, are stressing the idea that she had had this for 12 years. It wasn't just a temporary thing. There are some things about that you need to realize. With an issue of blood like this, she would have been unclean, and anybody she touched would have been unclean. So that's the reason why she's not going to approach Jesus directly. So she's going to try to sneak up on him and try to get this healing the best way she can without actually coming in contact with too many people, or at least them knowing that she was coming in contact with them. The devout Jews wore a robe with fringes on them. It was actually required by the law. It's in Numbers 15, verses 37 beginning, and it's in Deuteronomy 22 and verse 12. And the fringes of these robes had 4 tassels. And as well, there was a white thread. The tassels were white thread, and they had a blue thread woven through them. And they would remind the Jews of every time he dressed that he was a man of God, and so forth. And later on, when it became dangerous in society to be known as a Jew, those things are worn as undergarments. They still exist today. If you go to a Jewish service, they'll be wearing these there's a tallis or a shawl that the Jews wear around his head and shoulders when he's at prayer. But at this time, in the time of Jesus, they're worn as an outer garment, and I think there were 2 in front and 2 behind. There may have been just 1 behind. I can't remember. 2 in front, 2 behind. And it's probably one of those tassels that she touched. She would have just wanted sort of the lightest touch imaginable, so that Jesus would not feel that he'd been made unclean, and so that nobody would see her, because it may be that her illness was well known, and so nobody would see her doing that. Now then, yes, go ahead. Yeah, would wear 4. Mother exercises occasionally at a Jewish community center, and she says that she's seen men there wearing those tassels. To do what? He's a what you call it. I think she means that he is somewhat, or the rabbi of one of there's two or three. I know at that community center she's talking about, I think there's at least three synagogues very close to it. So maybe one of the rabbis for those groups, or maybe just a member. About 6-7 inches long, yeah. Yes. Well, I think she thought Jesus could heal her. Jesus, the next verse we're going to read says that she was healed. Oh, excuse me. Okay, I'm sorry. My engineer is telling me I didn't repeat your question. We're going to get mics in the audience so I can quit doing this. Rita asks, did she feel that Jesus could heal her, or was she just taking a chance, or whatever? Jesus goes on to commend her by saying her faith had saved her. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But yes, I think she believed Jesus could heal her. But my personal opinion is because the nature of her disease, that she would not have wanted to directly ask him to touch her, because that would have involved him in being unclean. So she was trying to just touch the hem of his garment so that she could maybe be cleansed. And of course, it was a tremendous crowd around. She wouldn't have wanted the neighbors and everybody else to know. You wouldn't want to announce that you have an issue of blood. Everybody would have wouldn't have run exactly, but they sure would have backed up. And so it was just a situation where maybe this was the only way she could reach him.
Do you think that was being really considered Christ? Because he would have been unclean, even though he might not have known it.
I don't know exactly what their policy was, what their policy was on uncleanness. It may have been that if she touched his garment, that would technically have, or technically, legally not have made him unclean. Whereas if she had spoken to him and he had touched her with his hand, maybe she would have felt that would have made him unclean, and he'd had to go to the priest and all that sort of thing. Yes, I know. So anyway, with people thronging around him like this, as I say, I don't think she wanted everybody in town to know of her disease. She didn't want them to run from her. She shouldn't have been out here anyway. But she was doing what she felt she had to do. She had spent, as the Bible details, she had spent all of her money. She couldn't get well from the doctors. And so she was doing what she could. Yes. Okay. Jesus, I study from the King James a lot just because I'm used to it. Jesus, she came behind him, touched the border of his garment, and immediately her issue of blood stanched. When Jesus said, "Who touched me?" When all denied, Peter and they that were with him said, "Master, The multitude throng thee and press thee, and sayest thou, who touched me? Jesus said, somebody touched me, for I perceive. Now that's the way the King James words it. In Greek, the word is gnosko, which means I know. Now it's interesting that everybody was thronging around him. So he was. That's what Peter and the disciples said. What do you mean? Who touched you? Everybody's touching you. Everybody's around you. But he's thinking something else. He says, virtue is gone out of me. Yes, he could distinguish. He knew something happened. I suspect he knew who it was. Now, and I suspect that this woman, when she touched him, she knew she'd been healed. She says, she says, or in Mark it says, she said, if I may touch but his clothes, I shall be whole. And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up. In Mark, this is Mark 5:29. Straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body. That's not a good translation either. She felt in her body. The word again there being used, I believe, is gnosko, that she knew she was healed. Wasn't she felt it? It wasn't an emotional thing. She knew she was healed. That she was healed of that plague. And so again in Mark in verse 30, Jesus knowing in himself. So there you have that word used twice in Mark, but she would have known she was healed immediately, and I think she tried to hide. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, verse 47 back in Luke 8, when the woman saw that she was not hid. So when Jesus said, who touched me, and he's looking around, she's hiding. You know, there's such a big crowd. All she had to do was maybe reach an arm through and touch the tassel on his back. And then she immediately knew she was hid and would have drawn back so the crowd doesn't know she's there. And Jesus doesn't know she's there. He perceived that this had happened. Now, the explanation of why it happened, because everybody was touching him. You do have in the book of Acts, you have several cases of where they would send out handkerchiefs from the apostles to heal. You even have one instance where people would sit and hopefully the shadow of Peter would pass over them and they could be healed. But obviously, it's not just a case with Jesus of just managing to touch him that's going to heal you. So, and he explains that. He doesn't, I think that's why he's calling for this woman. He doesn't want her to think that this is just automatic, that everybody who touches him gets healed. He doesn't want her to think that it's magical. And so he's looking for her. And when she saw she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared unto him before all the people for what cause she had touched him, and how she was healed immediately. And he said unto her, daughter, be of good comfort, thy faith hath made thee whole. So it was because of her faith in touching him that she was healed. She had, and so to answer Rita's earlier question, did she think that Jesus could heal her? Well, obviously she thought Jesus could heal her, because Jesus said, your faith is what's done it. It wasn't just, sort of like a rock concert where I managed to get some rock star's autograph. It was she believed that she could be healed if he touched her or she touched him. And so it was her faith that healed her. And which suggests to me a consciousness on the part of Jesus of her. Even though she's behind him and touches him, he's aware of who's around him. He's aware of her touch. But that's why I say when he turns around and he's looking for her, she's hid herself because he wants to call her out and he wants this acknowledged so that she understands that what it was that healed her, and not just, the magic of being on the front row. It was that her faith had healed her. Yes, exactly. That's a very good point. And excuse me, I got to repeat. Rita says there seems to be something very tender, and that's a point I wanted to make, and it's very true, that addressing her as daughter. He was very loving. This woman's trembling. She falls down in front of him. She's compelled to make a confession. And you're right, it is very compassionate. And the one other element of it I want to mention is that Christ requires an open confession of faith. He doesn't want you to be a secret disciple. He says that in other places. Of course, we're going to come across it, that if we deny him before men, he'll deny us. And he says, if we confess him. And then he warns of some other Jews who believed in him, but they wouldn't confess him. Jesus didn't want her to be secret about this. He wanted an open confession of faith. And that's something that we have to realize too. A lot of people go to work and they don't ever really want to admit, I'm a Christian. Everybody's sort of, the Muslims are not too afraid of that. But a lot of Christians seem to be kind of reluctant to admit, well, I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus. I'm living my life because of him and at his direction and with his guidance. So, are there any other questions about this woman at the moment? I think I've pretty well covered the waterfront on that generally. To me, it's always been true. It's always been true that the most compelling thing almost about this is in the background, and that's Jairus. Jairus, who, the throng was there, the crowd was there, and everybody was there because Jairus is the ruler of the synagogue, and he's fallen down at Jesus' feet, begging him to come do something about his only daughter. The crowd throngs around, they're on the way, and there's this interruption. And I do think it's important to realize that Jesus does take the time. We'd have a tendency to say, well, I know you've had an issue of blood and you've had it for 12 years, but 12 years is 12 years. I'll get back to you in a minute. I'm on my way to deal with this more important case for this very important man who's really worried about his daughter's at the point of dying, so I'll come back to you. Jesus doesn't do that. He stops, he interrupts it, and he deals with this woman who is obviously faithful and obviously afraid, and he takes the time to deal with her and to deal with that situation. And when Rita mentioned the idea of his compassion, I think that the fact that he's willing to interrupt a very important man, a very dire situation where hers is not dire. She's been at it for 12 years, big deal. But it was a big deal to her and required just about as much courage for her to sneak in and try to touch him as anything else. So it is it is a matter of concern. Look in verse 49. While he yet spake, there cometh one from the ruler of the synagogue's house, saying to him, Thy daughter is dead. Trouble not the master. Now, I wanted to, if I can take just a minute, I'll have to dig for some notes. Jairus would have been just champing at the bit over this delay, this wait that we're seeing here. I wanted to pick up a word. I'm going to have to look for my notes to find it. So sort of bear with me as I look for them. One of these days I'll take the time. It'll take me about another day to get all these notes organized. I'm sorry for my poverty of note taking. Here's the note I was looking for. The word that is used here, Jairus must have been pestering Jesus. You know? Wouldn't you have been? He wants to get Jesus out to his daughter. The word that is used here for where it says trouble ye. Let's see, where was I? Let me refine myself. Trouble not the master, 49. The word means to flay the skin off of someone. The word is actually skule, and it's translated trouble. It literally means to flay the skin off of someone. And so Jairus undoubtedly, it's figurative for agitate or distress or annoy, but Jairus must have been kind of pestering him. Yes, pestering would be a good word. We need to move on here. My daughter's waiting. And so why trouble ye the master any further? Now, it's also interesting that Jesus, this statement doesn't come to Jesus. Jesus overhears this because the conversation is addressed to the Jesus. Verse 35 in Mark, where did I say? Mark 5 says, while he yet spake, there came from the ruler of the synagogue's house certain which said, Thy daughter is dead, why troublest thou the master any further? This statement isn't made to Jesus, and Jesus was in the middle of conversing. When that statement is made, he's in the middle of conversing with the woman with the issue of blood. And so Jesus overhears this remark and immediately or shortly breaks off. So it says in verse 50, when Jesus heard it, and of course that would have been, he overheard it, he would have hustled off to hurry along. Fear not, believe only, she shall be made whole. And when he came into the house, he suffered no man to go in, save Peter and James and John, and the father and the mother of the maiden. So this throng that was just pressing him around him, he gets rid of them. And in verse 52, all wept and bewailed her greatly. Now that's probably an understatement, at least compared to what would be true of our funerals these days. There was certainly, of course, in the case of death, there would be people who would be crying and wailing. But these people had a very fancy, or at least a very involved mourning process. For instance, one of the Jews makes the statement, Whoever is remiss in mourning over the death of a wise man deserves to be burned alive. But there were a number of mourning customs that would have been going on at this time, or have happened just before Jesus got there. There was the rending of garments. They were required to tear their garments. There's about 39 rules and regulations about how they were to tear those garments. The tear had to be made when you were standing. The clothes were to be rent to the heart, all the way through. So that the skin was, I'm not going to do that, you'll be grateful. So that the skin was exposed. For a father and mother, the tear had to be directly over the heart. For others, it was on the right side. Father and mother, torn right over the heart. Everybody else over the right side. And I suppose that's to distinguish the father and mother. It had to be big enough for a fist. Couldn't be just a little tear. It had to be big enough for a fist to be inserted into it. And for 7 days, the tear had to be left gaping open. It had to be left gaping. The next 30 days, it could be loosely stitched, but it still had to be able to be seen. You couldn't stitch it so well that it was like a finished stitch. You had to be able to see it. And then after those 30 days, then it could be permanently repaired. It would have been improper, of course, for women to rend their garments in that way. And so the women were required to rend their inner garment. They wore two garments in private, and then reverse the inner garment and the outer garment, so that the outer garment would have the tear, the inner garment would be torn in the back, but they both had to be torn. And her outer garment would be torn enough to show the inner garment. So that's one of the things that would have happened. They would have all torn their clothes in that process when the child died. There was an enormous amount of wailing. A book called The Land and the Book by Thompson says, in every city and community, women are very good at this business, and they keep themselves ready. It's actually a job. You actually hired them, and they were ready to go. So they were professional mourners. I still, I think those things still exist here in the U.S. I remember years ago, I went out to a small country town to preach a funeral. Oh, it was a cold day. But I got there and I preached the funeral, and somebody came out and shook my hand, one lady, and she said, that's the best one I've heard today. There'd been 3 funerals that day before I got there. She had been there for them all, and she thought I had the best sermon of the 3, which was an honor of sorts. But the whole idea of her sitting there all Saturday through 3 funerals, there was a small town. There wasn't much going on, and maybe she knew everybody. But anyway, these professional mourners would be there already mourning and ready to go to infuse any real mourners that showed up to make sure they cried. And they knew these professional mourners knew about everybody in town. And when you came, they would, touch the strings to make sure you cried too at this funeral. They were going to say the sad things, this is just like your Uncle Bill. Remember him? Do you remember all those sad times when he died? Okay, and so everybody cries at the funeral. But that was their job. They got paid to do that. And of course, there were always flute players. For some reason, they associated the sound of the flute with death. And the Jewish laws, the Talmud even requires that the husband is bound to bury his wife and to make lamentations according to the customs. The very poorest among the Israelites would require no less than 2 flutes and 1 wailing woman. So even if you were dead broke, you had to hire 2 flute players and one of the good professional wailing women. The rich folks had to hire more. There would be more flute players and more wailers. And in Rome, that was true too. For instance, at the funeral of the Emperor Claudius, Seneca tells us that there was such a loud noise, a shrilling from all these flute players, that he was kind of afraid and thought Claudius himself heard them, who was dead. And this, of course, the flute players got everybody crying as a result of all the furor. So when this says Jesus came to this home, and there was a lot of wailing and weeping, the law required them to bury this child within a day, within 24 hours. So they were Johnny on the spot. They knew the wailing women would have known she'd been sick. They're ready to go just as soon as she dies. The flute players would have already been hired and been waiting. They're ready to go, and this was an important man. So he wouldn't have been just had 2 flute players and 1 wailing woman. There would have been a big crowd. Everybody at the synagogue would have been wailing and hollering and blowing the flute and all that sort of thing. So this is the Bible. Even I guess the Bible assumed that everybody knew what was going on, but it's sort of, to us in our society, it leaves him. It's a little understated almost in this. All wept and bewailed her, and he said, "Weep not. She is not dead, but sleepeth." Now this, believe it or not, is a real subject of controversy for some reason or another, because there's a lot of people who assume, well, maybe she was just sleeping, and Jesus I saw one guy who I like a lot, but he's sort of a modernist in some respects, especially when you're talking about the miracles. I wanted to talk about that. I'll get back to it before we're done. I better hurry. Who argue that where was I? What am I doing here? Who argue that Jesus was just a good diagnostician. So I wanted to talk about it just a little bit. It's look at Luke here in 8:52. I want to compare that with John 11, verses 11 through 15, for that idea of sleep. He says, John 11, this is the death of Lazarus. Before Lazarus has died, Jesus delays 2 days before he goes to see. Here's Lazarus is sick. And he delays 2 days, and finally he says in John 11:11, "These things said he, and after that he saith unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep. Then said his disciples, Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well. Howbeit Jesus spake of his death, but they thought he had spoken of taking rest in sleep. Then said Jesus unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I'm glad for your sakes I was not there, to the intent you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go on to him." The word that is used here, it's a different word in Luke 8 than it is in John 11, but it's the same idea. The word means to fall asleep, to drop off to sleep, but Thayer says that it also means euphemistically it is to be dead. And so Jesus is using, as he does on other occasions, the idea of sleep to describe the idea of being dead. It's we do the same thing in our language. We don't like to just say someone's dead. We'll say he's passed over, or he's taken the boat across the river Styx, or, we have any number of different expressions to avoid actually saying he's dead. And so I think that's the sort of thing that Jesus does on this occasion. I've got too much I want to work in here real quickly. Yeah, I wanted to, excuse me, I'm backing up. I just discovered a note I wanted to work in. It's kind of interesting. Eusebius, who's writing 200 or 300 years after the New Testament, says that of the woman with the issue of blood, that that Eusebius says there was erected at her birthplace, which was supposed to be Peneus, a memorial that the Emperor Julian later removed to place his own statue there. And this is an apocryphal gospel, the Gospel of Nicodemus, where the woman appears under the name Veronica. And she is supposed to have appeared in the presence of Pilate, proclaiming Jesus' innocence. And apparently the idea is that on the way to Golgotha, this Veronica wiped the face of Jesus. At least that's the tradition from Eusebius. I don't know. It's interesting that Eusebius gives her a name and says that there was some other interaction besides this, but it's not in the Bible, and it's just sort of interesting to me that this would be there. Here's another note related to your comment about the fact that he speaks lovingly to this woman. This is in Luke 8:48. This is the only place in the Gospels where our Lord's reported to have used a loving word to any woman. And then it goes on to talk about, that particular commentator goes on to talk about the same legend from Eusebius about her. We're out of time. I thought sure I could finish the 8th chapter. We will briefly finish the 8th chapter next time and go on into the 9th. I appreciate your listening, and I hope we had maybe a listener or two or a watcher or two on the internet as well. We'll see how long our engineer can. Oh, we had 3 watchers. I also have heard from, oh, help me, Mother. You talked about them on the way to church. Connors. The Connors were pretty excited about. And of course, they're having difficulty just getting out in the best of circumstances, but they were pretty excited about the ability to watch our services and classes from home as well. Why don't we go to the Lord in prayer? And Glenn, would you dismiss us today?
Father, thank you for doing your best to give them